Welcome everybody. Today's lesson we're going to be talking about chapter number 4, preventive maintenance and troubleshooting. All right, what are we going to talk about? So, first, we're going to discuss preventive maintenance techniques. We're going to explain how this preventive maintenance must be performed and why they must be performed on all your personal computers, or if you work for an organization, why you should be worried about performing preventive maintenance on all of those computers. We're going to describe PC preventive maintenance in both hardware and software level. We're going to talk about that in a sec. On 4.2, we're also going to be talking about the troubleshooting process. How does the troubleshooting process works? What do we need to be doing in order to troubleshoot common PC issues? Troubleshoot problems with PCs and peripheral devices. Not only we're going to be discussing all the common problems and the common issues we have with our PCs, but also with the peripheral devices that are connected to them. We're going to learn how to describe each step of the troubleshooting process. We're going to identify some common problems and solutions for some of the PC issues we have. And finally, we are going to talk about the troubleshoot computer components and peripherals by using the 6-step approach that we're going to be learning. All right, so let's get started. Let's start with preventive maintenance and why we should be performing a preventive maintenance and why we should have a plan for doing a preventive maintenance often into our computers. Well, we may have different reasons why we would be interested in performing preventive maintenance, and here are the benefits that we're looking for. So the first of them is that the preventive maintenance allows us to control the computer location or environment and how it influences the amount of dust and the amount of other particles that may accumulate into our components. So every time you start to worry about preventive techniques for a certain computer, guys, pay attention to what type of environment your computer is located at. Is it an environment that requires a cleaning process more often? Is the computer installed in a construction site, for example? Does that really require you to clean out the filters and remove all the particles near the fans and so on and so forth? Another thing you should consider when you do preventive maintenance is the computer use. Okay? How often do you use that computer? How often does that computer stays on? And how often does the fan stay on? That will influence how often you need to perform the preventive maintenance. And that is because the more time your computer is on, the more time the fans are operating. And the more time the fans are operating to keep the computer cooled, the more particles, the more dust it accumulate inside the components. All right, as you guys can see here, this is an example of a pretty dust environment, I would say, where a computer accumulates a huge amount of dust near its power supply. So as you guys can see, this power supply basically has a fan embedded. So this fan is responsible for cooling down all the components inside the power supply. And as I just mentioned, the more time you keep this computer on, the more time the fan will be operating and the more particles will be accumulating near the dust filters. Okay? As you can see here, this computer case has a small dust filter. As you guys can see, I'm just going to hover the mouse near it. So as you guys can see it in here, there is some sort of a dust filter that can be easily removed and cleaned up. All right. So for those computer cases that don't have a dust filter, it might be necessary to disassemble some of the computer parts in order to clean out the components. Okay. Sometimes just using a cloth or a dust is enough to remove most of the particles and most of the dust accumulated. Uh, Dust on the outside is usually easier to be removed. So sometimes on the outside of the computer you can just use a cloth, and that would be most of the time effective to remove the dust. However, when the components are accumulated in the inside components of the machine, you have to disassemble some of the parts and you have to do a rough cleaning inside the computer components. Okay. What else we need to worry about when we're doing this type of preventative maintenance, especially when we are removing a certain amount of dust from our components? Guys, before you perform these type of preventive maintenance, make sure the computer components are not hot. So keep the computer components off for a while, wait down for the computer parts to cool down, and then you start performing this. Remove dust from the inside of computer using a combination of compressed air. So sometimes some of the components inside the computer, they're really hard to just use a cloth to wipe down the dust that accumulated over there. So most of the time you have to utilize a compressed air can. So you can just buy these compressed air can specifically to clean and inside components of a computer, and that will uh, make your life much easier when you perform this type of operation. You can also use some airflow ESD vacuum cleaners, and pay attention to this observation, guys. If you use a vacuum cleaner to clean out the dust from a computer part, make sure this vacuum cleaner is ESD. Okay, so what happens is most of the time if you use a random vacuum cleaner, these vacuum cleaners may discharge a current into your computer components, and that may damage some of your computer parts. All right. Another thing, if you clean the inside components, make sure you're using a small lint-free cloth. Once again, some type of cloths that you may use to clean the inside parts of the computer may induce a current in some of the computer parts, and that may damage your internal computer parts as well. So make sure you utilize all the proper tools in order to perform an interior dust cleaning and thus a preventive maintenance to remove all the dust from your computer parts. All right. Ah, just one more thing, guys. Sometimes the dust that accumulates in the inside of the computer, they can be prevented by just cleaning the outside of the computer. So if you keep your outside parts clean as possible, it's gonna be a little bit harder for dust to get inside of the computer. So what I usually suggest is try to keep your outside parts as clean as possible. That's gonna reduce the amount of dust that accumulates in the inside as well. Awesome. So let's talk about the internal components that we should be looking at when we're performing the preventive maintenance. So there's a basic checklist, as you guys can see here on this slide. And these basic checklist for the components you need to inspect for dust and damage includes the CPU heatsink and fan assembly, the RAM modules, the storage devices, the adapter cards, the cables, the power devices, keyboard, and mouse. So all of these components, guys, make sure you do a check on a regular basis, and make sure you keep all these parts cleaned, and make sure you keep all of them free of dust as much as possible. All right. Awesome. How about the environmental concerns when we talk about preventive maintenance? So some computer parts, they operate in temperature range and under uh, an optimal humidity range. So we need to make sure we keep all of our computer parts between these ranges that are specified by the manufacturer. Okay? So let's say you have a desktop. Okay? You have a desktop computer, and this desktop computer is an Intel product. So it's got an Intel CPU, an Intel motherboard. So Intel specifies the temperature range, the optimal temperature range for all of its processors. Okay? So what happens is some of them are usually around the 90 degrees Celsius. So if your computer parts they go beyond the 90-degree limit, what happens is that your computer starts to randomly shut down. Okay? So we need to make sure our computer operates under the optimal temperature range and the humidity ranges. All right? So make sure you keep track of it. Make sure you observe all the temperatures and everything, uh, all the conditions that your computer is operating under. And once again, one more time, if you keep your computer in an environment that has more dust, that has more particles, you need to perform the preventive maintenance more often. All right. Now let's talk about the software side. So far, we always talked about the hardware and how we can clean the components on both outside and inside parts and so on and so forth. But there's also the software part of the preventive maintenance, and for those we need to verify that our computer components uh, have the latest software and they have the current versions of the operating system as well. Okay, so we need to follow the policies if we are in an organization, if we're working for a certain company. We need to make sure we follow all the company's guidelines on how to keep the system up to date and perform the program updates. Also, we need to create a software maintenance schedule. Okay, so we need to make sure we review and install the appropriate security software and driver updates. Update the virus definitions, guys. Your antivirus is just as effective as it is up to date. All right. We live in a time where viruses are being created every single second, every single minute. There's a virus being created out there. All right. So we need to make sure our antivirus has the latest definition files and it has the latest capabilities to identify a threat, to identify a virus or a spyware. Remove unwanted or unused programs. Once again, if you have programs that you do not use, it's highly recommended for you to remove them or uninstall them. Okay? And that is because some of the programs may be running on the background, they may be consuming computer resources, they may be consuming uh, CPU, and they may be consuming RAM as well. So we always advise that you remove all of these unwanted or unused programs from your machine as well. Make sure you scan hard drives for errors and defragment hard drives as well. Okay. All right. Now let's get down to the troubleshooting process. What is the troubleshooting process about? Okay. So guys, troubleshooting is not only coming to a computer and just doing some random checks. All right. So if you have an effective troubleshooting technique that you're going to be improving throughout your years of experience in the industry, you're going to be developing the optimal solution and the optimal troubleshooting process that is according to your knowledge. Okay? We're going to be describing one here, a troubleshooting process soon. Okay? But what is it? What is troubleshooting? How do you require troubleshooting? Why should you be doing troubleshooting? Okay? So troubleshooting requires an organized and logical approach. Okay? Once again, when you do troubleshooting, you're actually interested in finding out or discovering a certain computer issue, and you're interested in resolving that issue. Okay? So as you guys might be thinking, this is part of a daily life of a computer desktop support technician or whatever other title the industry may give him. But these guys just basically responsible for troubleshooting issues in computer hardware and computer software. Okay, so troubleshooting is a skill refined over time. Just like I said, you're going to be tuning in your troubleshooting skills. You're going to be tuning in your troubleshooting technique according to the knowledge that you acquire throughout the years of experience that you might get. Okay, so before you begin troubleshooting problems, always follow the necessary precautions to protect data on a computer. Okay, so guys, please do not start doing a troubleshooting process before you make sure the data that you are playing with or the data that you are performing any operation is secured and is backed up. Okay. All right. Now here we have a systematic troubleshooting process. Okay. Now you guys never worked in the industry. You don't have, some of you never actually worked with this before. So we have a common systematic approach that we start doing in our careers, and that allows us to follow a logical sequence for the troubleshooting process, and that's going to assist us in tuning in and improving our troubleshooting techniques the more experienced we get. All right. So the first step in the troubleshooting techniques is identifying the problem. The second step is establishing a theory of probable cause. The third step is test the theory to determine the cause. Fourth step, establish a plan of actions to resolve the problem and implement the solution. The fifth step, verify full system functionality and, if applicable, implement preventive measures. And the last step, or the sixth step, document the findings, actions, and outcomes. All right. Now let's talk about each one of them separately, and let's see what is involved in each one of the steps that I have just mentioned. So when you do step number one, you identify the problem. And there are a few ways you can do to identify the problem, okay? The first thing you need to do is identify customer information, okay? Identify the company name, identify the contact name, identify the address, and identify the phone number for that specific problem. Check the computer configuration. Make sure you understand what is the manufacturer and model of the computer that you're dealing with. If it's not a computer, it also applies. So if you're troubleshooting a printer, make sure you know the manufacturer, the model, and so on and so forth. Make sure you understand what the operating system is, the network environment, the connection type that is being used, and make sure you have a description of the problem. Okay? So make sure you talk to the person that reported the issue, and make sure you understand everything that the person is complaining about a certain computer, okay, or a certain issue. And there are actually two ways you can do this problem description, and that is by asking open-ended questions or asking closed-ended questions, okay? As the name already says, open-ended questions would be more general questions, and that might be, when was the last time you accessed these resources? When was the last time that you browsed for these websites? When was the last time that you connected to the internet? So these general questions, they are open-ended questions. When you do closed-ended questions, they are usually yes or no questions. So you have something in mind, you just ask for a confirmation, okay? So that would be something like, okay, so the last time you accessed this web page was yesterday at 12 p.m. and the person would reply yes or no. So these would be a closed-ended question. They are more specific. They're just down to business. They just ask the person exactly what you need to know. All right? Make sure when you identify the problem, you also check for error messages. Make sure you check for beep sequences, LED changes, and the pole sequence. All right? Step number two, after you move out of step number one, you go to step number two. After you identify the problem, you establish a theory. All right? So you may have a certain problem, but that problem specifically may be caused by many issues. Okay? In one problem may be caused by many causes. Okay? And a way to establish a theory for this probable cause is you check if the device is powered off, you power switch for an outlet is turned off, check all of this, okay? Make sure you have proper power coming into the computer. Check for surge protector, check if it's turned on, if it's turned off. Check external cables being loose. Check all the cables if they're properly connected. Check for non-bootable disk, okay? Sometimes the computer is not starting just because the non-bootable disk is selected as the boot drive. Okay, this is an easy fix. You go to the motherboard BIOS settings, you just make a single change, computer is back on again. Make sure you check for incorrect boot order. So I just talked about that. And after you do this, establish this theory of probable cause, you move on to step number 3 of the troubleshooting process. In step number 3, you do the test for the theory to determine the cause. Okay, there are some common steps to determine the cause, and they are: ensure the device is powered on, ensure the power switch for an outlet is turned on. So here you determine that everything that was supposed to be on are actually on, and you check that the cables are correctly secured, and you check that the designated boot drive is correctly selected. Then you move on to step number 4. You establish a plan of action to resolve the problem and implement the solution. After you move out of step number 3, if no solution is achieved so far from the previous 2 steps that we just analyzed, step number 2 and 3, you're going to be performing the following. Okay? Help desk repair logs. So you check the repair logs, see if any repair has been previously done. You check with other technicians if they had a similar issue. You check manufacturer fact websites for these issues that you're having. You check technical websites. You check groups. You check computer manuals. You're also going to be looking for device manuals in particular. And you can also ask your questions on online forums, and you can do the internet for searching people that had similar issues and how they resolved those issues. And then you finally move on to step number 5, verify full system functionality. So after you perform steps number 2, 3, and 4, you make sure you reboot the computer and you make sure your full system functionality is being reestablished. You ensure multiple applications work properly. You verify that the applications that has been previously recorded as not working are now working. You verify network and internet connections. You print a document. If you're troubleshooting a printer, obviously you want to try it out and print the document and see if it works. After you have rebooted the computer, ensure all attached devices work properly as well, and you ensure that no error messages are being received in your system. After you perform step number 5, which is just basically a check that everything is working, you move on to step number 6, which is document findings, actions, and outcomes. Okay? So for this step, guys, you're just basically creating a documentation. You're just basically creating a file and recording all the steps that you've taken in order to resolve that specific issue. Okay? You discuss the solution implemented with the customer if you have access to the customer. You ask the customer if the solution was actually what the customer was expecting, and if the outcome is necessarily what the customer was expecting to have. Have the customer verify the problem by himself or herself. So not only you be checking that the computer is back to normal operation, but you're also going to ask the customer to verify it as well. You provide the customer with all the paperwork necessary, if paperwork is necessary whatsoever. So if under your company's policy it specifies you need to give the customer a paperwork at the end of the job, you need to make sure you do that. All right? You document the steps taken to solve the problem in the work order and in the technician's journal. So guys, if you start working as a technician, and specifically a help desk technician and other titles that the industry may give you, it would be really interesting if you can start writing your own journal, and within this journal you can specify some of the most common issues you're encountering in your career, and this may help you in the troubleshooting process for other types of issues you may have in the future. You also document any components used in the repair if there are any. So if you have replaced the hard drive for an SSD, you just might list that you have performed this and that you needed this device to be changed for another device. Document the amount of time spent to resolve the problem is also another important thing. So if you work by yourself, and let's say you are a contractor or you have your own business, it is really interesting if you keep track of the amount of hours you spend to resolve a certain issue. And that's going to help you out in order for you to make future quotes on a certain job or so on and so forth. Awesome. We finished with the troubleshooting technique and the troubleshooting process. Now let's talk about some of the PC common problems and solutions. Okay, so computer problems, they can be attributed to hardware, software, networks, or sometimes all of them. Okay, so you need to make sure you start troubleshooting. Let's say I'm going to start troubleshooting the hardware first and see if there's a hardware issue. If there's no hardware issue, you move on to troubleshoot what software issues you might have in your machine. And if there's an issue with the network, you can check the network for issues as well. And just keep in mind that sometimes it may be a combination of these three. It not necessarily may be all of the three at the same time, but sometimes it might be two of them. So you may not have a hardware issue necessarily, but you may have a combination of software and network issue going on in your environment. Okay. Issues with storage devices. So we have some common issues here related to certain computer components. So you may have storage device issues, and these problems are often related to loose or incorrect cable connections. Sometimes it's because of incorrect drive and media formats, and sometimes it's basically because of an incorrect jumper or a BIOS settings. Now, talking about the motherboard and internal components, these specific problems, they may be caused by incorrect or loose cables. One more time, they might be because of failed components. So for example, a RAM. So a RAM may be failed and may be preventing your computer from booting up or something like that. Or even your computers may be starting, but while you're performing a certain test, the computer is randomly crashing and you get the blue screen of death and so on and so forth. After you perform a RAM test in your computer, you identify that is an issue with the RAM. So that was a failed component. You had to substitute, you have to swap for a new part in order to make it work. But these other issues with the motherboard and internal components might be caused by an incorrect driver that is installed, and that may also be caused by corrupted updates that you performed in your system. Now, talking about the power supply issues, they are often caused by faulty power supply, loose connections, or and inadequate wattage. Okay, so sometimes power supply issues are just as simply resolved as just checking the connection between the power supply and the motherboard. Sometimes it's just a loose connection in between the power supply and the motherboard, and that is an easy fix. Sometimes it's just a faulty power supply and there's not much we can do except replacing the power supply itself. And sometimes it's inadequate wattage. So if you have issues with your power outlet, that might be causing lower voltage, lower current into your system components. That might cause an issue. Your computer may not start, and so on and so forth. We also have the CPU and memory issues. We may have processor issues that may be caused by uh, uh, too high temperatures. So most of the time we have issues with the processor is because the processor is overheating, and that may be because you have a faulty fan. You may be having uh, too much dust into your fan, and that is preventing cooled air from reaching your CPU, and that may cause your system to randomly restart and some weird things going on. All right. So you can do that by checking the CPU operating temperature. Make sure your system is operating under the manufacturer's recommended temperature. We may also have display issues, and those display issues, they may be caused by incorrect settings, they may be caused by loose connections, and they may be caused by incorrect or corrupted drivers. Okay? So if you guys just notice here for a second, one of the most common issues that is related to a lot of the problems that we have just listed is the loose connections. Okay? So we have loose connections as an issue for the motherboard and internal components. We have loose connections as an issue for the power supply. We have loose connections as an issue for our displays. So guys, what I usually like to do in my troubleshooting process, I love to check power supply loose cables to make sure that there's no issue whatsoever in there, because these cause issues in the motherboard and internal components. It causes issues with the power supply itself, it causes issues with displays, and so on and so forth. So usually what I like to do is I like to check all the cable connections in all of my devices and make sure all the cables are securely placed and are secured where they're supposed to be, and that they are properly connected. But once again, it depends if you want to start troubleshooting process by checking the storage device. If you want to do, it's up to you. Like I said, it's just a way of doing it. All right. So now, guys, we have an interactive tool in Netacad that allows us to study some of the common issues we might have. I've just given you an example here for the common issues we may encounter with displays. So if you click into the problem and you have identified the problem that the display has power but no image, what is it that may be happening? You just click on the interactive button and you can actually verify what can be made. You can also download a PDF file with all of these, but when you click into it, you see the probable cause. So it might be because the video cable is loose or damaged. It might be because the computer is not sending a video signal to the external display, and there would be an issue with the GPU itself, the unit responsible for transmitting all the signal data into the display. And here are the possible solutions you may take in order to resolve these issues. Reconnect or replace the video cable. Use the FN key along with the multi-purpose key to toggle to the external display. So this usually is a solution for laptops, because most of the desktops, they don't even have the FN key. But for the laptops, you just have to use the FN key and the display icon that shows up in some of the F keys, and that would allow you to change the output. All right. We also have some common problems and solutions for CPU and memory. Once again, I'm just going to discuss one of them, and it's one of your activities is to go through all of them into Netacad. But the first one, the computer will not boot or locks up. So what's the probable cause of this? The CPU may be overheating, is one of them. The CPU fan is failing, is also another one. And the CPU has already failed. And here are possible solutions for these issues. Reinstall the CPU, replace the CPU fan, add fans to the case. Another one that solves these issues most of the time that is not listed in here is replacing the thermal paste. So the thermal paste is the paste that is in between your processor and the CPU fan heatsink. So usually replacing the CPU thermal paste will resolve this issue if your fan is not failing. If the fan is failing, you need to replace the fan as well. CPU has already failed. What is the solution for this? So if your CPU has already failed, there's not much you can do except to replace the CPU itself. All right, and make sure you replace the CPU before you start researching for CPUs that can be a replacement for the current one that has failed. Make sure you check the socket. Make sure you verify that the CPU that you're replacing is a proper and compatible socket with your motherboard. Okay. Awesome. Now, how about the power supply issues that we may have? Once again, I'll talk about the first one. You guys are responsible for going on and checking other issues as well, probable causes and possible solutions for that. So the probable cause for the computer not turning on, it might be because the computer is not properly plugged in into the AC outlet. It may be because the AC outlet is faulty. It may be because the power cord is faulty. It may be because the power supply switch is not turned on. It also might be because the power supply switch is set to the incorrect voltage. It might be because the power button is not connected correctly into the front panel connector. It also might be because the power supply has failed. Okay, so you have many probable causes for this issue. But what are the possible solutions for this? Make sure you plug the computer to a known good AC outlet. So try it in one AC outlet, try another one you know works, try another one if possible, and make sure you try it out and make sure you identify that the issue is not with the AC outlet itself. Plug the computer into a known good AC outlet, use a known good power cord, make sure you test out different power cords. It might be an issue with your power cord itself, and that is an easy replacement. You can just try to get another power cord, plug it in, see if it works. If it does, you know the other one was damaged. Turn on the power supply switch. Make sure you turn on the power supply switch uh, on the back of the computer. So if you have a desktop, there's usually a switch on the back of the power supply. Make sure that switch is on before you actually turn on to press the power button on the front panel. Okay, the one that stays on the front of the computer. So actually, I like to say this, but uh, before you make sure you turn on a desktop, make sure you turn it on twice. And that is because you need to make sure the power supply is turned on and there is a small switch on the back, and you make sure you turn on the button on the front panel. So for desktop, you usually, when you turn it on, make sure you can turn it on twice. Correctly orient the power button to the front case panel connector and reconnect. So sometimes if you're building your own computer or if you're replacing the motherboard, make sure this front panel button is in the correct power supply header. If it's not, you're going to turn on the button and nothing's going to happen. Or sometimes people will connect the power button into the reset button and the other way around. So make sure they're connected to the proper header on the motherboard. Install a good known power supply. So if all of these that you've done, they do not solve the issue, there might be a power supply issue itself. It may be an internal damaged component of the power supply. So try another power supply, a power supply that you know it's a good power supply, and that may solve your issue. Okay. Sometimes it may be useful if you troubleshoot desktops and if you troubleshoot many issues with power supply, and so on and so forth. It might be useful for you as a technician to acquire a tool called the power supply tester, and that allows you to check all the power supply voltage and current and make sure they operate in an optimal value that's going to actually be efficient to turn on your computer. Awesome. Now let's talk about the common problems and solutions for storage devices. When you have an issue with storage devices, you may check a few things as well. I'm going to talk about one of them, and once again, your homework is going on into Netacad and checking each one of them separately, okay? But when you have an issue that the computer does not recognize as storage device, probable causes may be the power cable is loose, once again, the data cable is loose, jumpers are set incorrectly, storage device has failed, storage device settings in BIOS are incorrect. And here are some possible solutions for the following issues. Make sure you secure the power cable, make sure you secure the data cable, make sure you reset the jumpers, make sure you replace the storage devices if you think they have failed, make sure you reset the storage device settings in BIOS. Alright? Now let's move on to the motherboard and internal component issues. Once again, I'll talk about one of them. If you have issues with the clock on the computer no longer keeping the correct time, or the BIOS settings are changing when the computer is rebooted, this is a common issue with the CMOS battery. It may be loose or it may be all drained. Okay, so simple solution: make sure you secure the battery if the battery is loose, and make sure you replace the battery if the battery is drained. So you try it in, try to secure it, make sure it's not loose. If it still doesn't solve the issue, it may be because it's already drained up. All right, and we finish it up. Now, let's talk about some personal reference tools that you may use in order to research more about the troubleshooting techniques you may use in your daily life as a computer technician or whatever other role you may take troubleshooting computers. Okay? Make sure you keep personal reference tools. Make sure you have your own personal guides. You have your manufacturer manuals ready. You have quick reference guides. You have repair journals and so on and so forth. Make sure you have notes and you take notes of issues. Make sure you go through the troubleshooting repair process. Make sure you keep your journal. Include the description of the problems, possible solutions, everything you have tried and hasn't solved the issue, everything that you have tried and has solved the issue. Make sure you document everything you're doing, and that's going to help you out to improve your troubleshooting techniques. Keep a history of repairs you have done. List the problems and repairs. Include the dates, include the replacement parts, and include customer information as well for warranty purpose and so on and so forth. Awesome. What are the other tools you guys may use in order to improve and in order to enhance your troubleshooting technique? Here I have listed some excellent sources for you to research, and there might be the internet, new groups, manufacturer facts, online computer manuals, online forums and chat, and technical websites as well. All right. There are also some advanced problems and solutions for hardware. Those are the issues that are more difficult to identify the source and they are more difficult to troubleshoot. Once again, going to leave this up to you guys as a homework. Just make sure you go on to all of these advanced problems and solutions, click on each one of them, identify the cause, and identify the solution for each one of them. Awesome. And we are nearly the end of this lecture. Before we finish it up, I need to make sure I mention to you guys about our hardware lab. So our hardware lab for this session is on campus, all right? So make sure you guys view eLearn for instructions how to book a session. But what basically is going to happen is you have to schedule in a time, you have to schedule in a lab for you to come in and do the hands-on thing for the lab, all right? So this lab is a troubleshooting hardware problems. As you guys can see, I took this out of the instructions. So you are required to have a computer with an operating system installed, and you will require to solve some hardware problems for a customer, and you have to make sure you follow the troubleshooting techniques you have studied in order to fix a certain issue. All right? Awesome. Chapter summary. So in this chapter, we talked about the preventive maintenance. We explained why it is important and why it must be performed. We described the PC preventive maintenance techniques. We described the troubleshooting process. We talked about the troubleshooting process. We identified the common problems and solutions for PCs. We troubleshoot computer components. We talked about the common problems. We talked about the common solutions. And we also use the 6-step troubleshooting process. And that is all for today's session, guys. If you have any questions, feel free to reach me up on the chat. Send me an email as well if you have questions and concerns. And that is all for today, guys. Make sure you download the lab manual before you come into the lab. Check whatever it is that you're going to be doing in the lab. Make sure you come to the lab ready, and make sure you schedule a time that suits you for you to come on campus and perform the lab. All right? Awesome, guys. So I'll see you next time. Take care.